Welcome to Conversations with Life. I'm Xochitl and I'm here with Cedar and Keith. And today we are going to talk about edges and how we can work with edges on the meaning path. And the thing that kind of inspired this is really funny because I recently went and got my first mammogram, and I had this experience of sort of being herded through a process like some kind of farm animal and people touching sensitive parts of my body, and there was literally no consent conversation whatsoever. I'm sure I signed it in the doc or something, right?
Yeah, that counts.
But then I came here that night for a recording, and I got a way better consent conversation from Keith hooking up my mic.
Tech for the win.
Go, Keith.
than I had in this medical setting. And so that got me, kind of revisiting a pretty intense original part of my journey. I learned a lot about consent as a midwife. And so I've kind of been revisiting the different places I've learned consent, the different things that brought up for me. And as Steve and I were talking about tonight's episode, it was like, well, let's kind of use edges and work consent and boundary into that. So I'm excited to see where this goes. I think it's going to be really cool.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about how this fits into our narrative. The idea of a personal growth path. Growth means that you find edges. And, that's one of the things. Relationship means that you find edges. Mm-hmm. And so, one side of that is consent. One side of that is, of course, we did that. I think we did at least one episode on boundaries. And this concept that you're going to get to a place where you're not sure.
Yeah.
And you tread with caution, and when somebody treads over you without caution, or you tread over somebody without caution. Certainly both have happened to me in this place where you're in you're in a possible growth state, and you're also, it strikes me, an edge. You're in a possible I'm getting traumatized state.
Totally.
Like at the same time, like the energy has gone up in an edge. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm on my path. I'm doing something new, or I'm doing something that feels maybe risky, or I'm doing something that feels like there's opportunity in it and energy in it. And that's an interesting place. So, I mean, I guess the question is, what do you do when you feel an edge, when you come to an edge? Mm-hmm. Like, how do you meet that with consciousness, with understanding, and make it into a growth space and not a traumatized space?
Right. And I just want a presence that we often can traumatize ourselves. We can push ourselves too fast, too soon, with too little resource, and do just as much, if not more damage than somebody else, you know?
True. Okay, so a couple of things around this, right? So firstly, I very, very recently and very suddenly became the dad of 3 teenage girls. Like way more suddenly than is expected, right?
Yeah. Combining families is definitely an edge.
Yeah, it's an edge. I'm talking to my 13-year-old, right? And we're talking about consent. And she's like, I consented. And I'm like, bro, you don't even know what consent means. I'm like, that's not a slight on you. That's not because you're not intelligent or because you don't understand or because you're supposed to and you don't. It's because, like, right now, you're 13. So your prefrontal cortex is not developed. And when you think of your future self, you think of a stranger. It's the same part of your brain that's activated. Like, you don't understand repercussions because they don't happen to you. They happen to future you. And that chick is someone else's problem, right? So it's not a bad thing that you don't get it. I'm like, but you can't actually give consent right now. That's why the law is in place, right? And I'm like, it just was such a aha moment for me to be like, oh shit, like, and I thought about the amount of times we give like the victims of things that are, consent violations, how often we, sort of come after them, and how often it comes to light that they are in a compromised mental state. Right?
They're in a childlike
sense. So either they are a child, or when they were a child, they were sexually abused, and so their sexual mentality has halted, or so many different things. And then yet society is still so quick and ready to blame, that person. And so I just was like sitting there thinking and looking at this girl who I love to death, who has had serious trauma, has neurodivergent, spicy, crazy going all over the place, right? Love her. She is hilarious. But she, she has all these things. And I'm like, I just wish I could stand as a shield to your prefrontal cortex right now and be like, no, you can't, you shall not pass. I'm like, but then that's taking away consent too, right? Then the other side of that is you start talking about, like, what do you do when you come to an edge? And it reminds me of a conversation I had with my dad. My dad and I, our whole lives shared one fear, and that was heights, right? Getting into tech, I got to shed my fear of heights, right? By force. But I asked my dad one time, I'm like, Dad, why are you afraid of heights? Because, like, you're not afraid of anything, right? And he's like, because I'm worried I'll jump. And I looked at him and I was like, what the hell are you talking about? And he's like, in Malta, we do cliff jumping all the time. It's like a fun thing that you do. He's like, so whenever I come up to an edge, like a balcony, I want to jump. There's a part of me, he's like, that's a concrete road 12 stories down of this hotel, but there's a part of me that wants to jump. And I'm like, yeah, there's a part of me that when I come to an edge, I kind of want to jump.
Yeah.
Even if I really, really fucking shouldn't.
I actually had that experience when I first learned how to drive, and it terrified me.
Yeah.
Because every time I went on a bridge or saw a guardrail, I had this huge impulse to just drive right through it. And here I am, like 14 years old in a car, just like, why is this happening?
I had that thought the other day.
I think whatever that part is, and, we can call it our perverse part or whatever, but whatever that is, that's the part that has the potential to traumatize us by making us jump before we're ready.
That's the fuck around and find out part.
It's necessary, like 14-year-old boys, it's been shown that their brain doesn't actually have the part that says this is the consequence to your action.
Yeah.
And this is actually a healthy human thing, So it's interesting, as you guys were talking, and as you were talking about those two circumstances, I think that points out two things about edges. One is I think we should maybe circle back around to it, but like one with your daughter, that is that you have to have the resource and maturity to meet the increased energy space.
Yeah.
While life almost assures us that we won't have the resource when the energy increases. Like that's the whole kind of crazy thing we're doing. It's nutty. But this thing, the perversity that is in every human being that is anti-life. When you amp up the energy, let's say you get somewhere high, the literal kinetic energy is higher, and the emotional reaction to mortality is higher, and all the things are present. You literally will be excited and stoked and like, ooh, this is exciting. And there's part of you is like, this is it. This is a chance. I've been trying to get out of this damn thing. Consciousness is painful. Like there's a weight to it. And when that perversity is there, I mean, I think it's why we die. There's no biological reason why we should die. I think we've probably talked about that before, where, part of you there's a death part. I call it the reverse part. Sometimes I call it the Satan part. And this is the part of you that hates life and just wants out of this fucking thing because this is a mess, right? And it's interesting that shows up when the energy is up, in that edge where it goes there.
Yeah, I want to bring it into the somatic realms. And I love that you brought up the cliff thing because that's one of the first things that I was like, okay, we're going to talk about standing at the edge of the cliff because there's a somatic experience that most people can relate to there. When you're standing, 3 yards away from the edge, you're not even aware there's an edge.
Yeah.
You're just being as you normally would be. but as you get closer, something happens.
Pucker. It's called pucker factor.
And so as you get,
That's a scientific term.
Yeah,
but I think like even walking ourselves and our listeners towards that edge will actually bring forth that somatic experience of what are the sensations that I start to feel when I'm getting close to an edge, when I'm getting closer to the edge of that cliff, when I'm standing on the edge, when I'm looking over. Those same sensations are going to come up when you are at an edge, say in a sexual situation, when you are at an edge, even just in a conversation, when you're starting to feel like it's time for the conversation to either close or move into a new space, you'll start to have those similar sensations. And so bringing that awareness into your body so you start to watch for that is going to help you, first of all, just be aware when it's coming and as you approach it so that you're not all of a sudden either there or pushed through it before you even realized you were getting close.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many things, like we talk about safeguards and education around those edges. You know, think about like when you're coming up to a cliff and there's always a sign, you know, that says like cliff edge or whatever it is, right? And we have those same signs. We build them for ourselves, right? When you're coming up to an edge of something and you're ready and you know that that edge exists, you can have those signs. And then there are times when you have no idea that it exists. That trauma is buried or it's blocked. And you've passed, like you said, that point of the trauma. And you're still like, it's almost like if you've seen any Looney Tunes, you know, they run off the cliff edge and for a minute they're still flying. And they're like, I'm doing great. I'm still running. And it's like, and then it goes,
can't make the noise. Yeah.
And then,
yeah.
Right? And you're like, sometimes, like I've been there. I've been there where I'm like, my feet aren't touching anything, but I think I'm okay. And then I look down and I'm like, fuck. And then I fall, like, you know.
Yeah.
And it's really trippy. It's like, where the hell are the signs?
Right. And they were in your body and you just either have had the awareness of that conditioned out of you. But I think another thing that can happen there in that, what Steve was talking about in a conversation earlier today is that hedge, that space between normal life and the actual edge, is there's all this mental chatter and story that could come up in that approach. So, for instance, you might meet somebody and experience the energy of attraction or some kind of link or something that's like, whoa, I could co-create with this person in some way. But because of past trauma or whatever, when you're in that hedge, your mind might actually interpret that as this is a creepy person or this is a dangerous person or this is whatever, and you run away. But if you start to get familiar with those sensations, you can say, oh, I'm experiencing an edge. This is a moment for me to check my resource, to feel into my body. And my body's discomfort isn't necessarily always a sign of danger, but it's a sign of an approach of an edge. And sometimes it's the exact edge that we need more than anything to cross over, but we also need to be as aware and in consent as we can.
Yeah. Another thing that happens at the edge in an increased energy situation, just even a life crisis or anything, you know, is that all the energies that we don't want show up at the same time as the energies we do want, because life and death show up together, right? They show up together. And it's kind of funny, like in relationship, masculine and feminine show up together. When you're experiencing someone else, a draw to someone else's feminine, you know, Jungian senses, you're meeting your anima. You're actually, it's activating your own femininity, and you like it, right? But you have to work with it. You have to like meet it, right? So if I feel, thanks to reels on Facebook or whatever, I get to watch a lot of people doing ridiculously risky behavior.
Oh yeah.
Like jumping off a snowboard down a cliff that just looks like death. You know, for me and most normal people would be death, but these people face that so often that they just, that's another day in the office for people. And, adrenaline junkies, people get into this place where they only feel alive on an edge that is so...
When you're addicted to that.
So much. So, it's interesting because one of the things I think that people don't do is rest. So on a spiritual path, especially like some people are aggressive in that way, like they something in them pushes, and I'm one of those people. My energy just pushes me into experience, and to take the time and just say, I'm going to step out and just be in. I no growth today. No, I'm not going to meet anything. Then stay in. I'm going to not. I mean, that can be its own kind of edge, but I'm just going to find a groove and stay in it. Is okay and good. Now, if you never get into the growth space and the edge space, then I don't think you've really lived.
Right. And I think that's what people mean when they say, Keith even said this episode or two ago, like, there's no growth without discomfort. And I always take a little bit of issue with that, because I think this ties into this whole consent thing, is growth also happens in greenhouses and gardens. So there's a level of nourishment and gentleness and support that can actually make the growth happen better. So it's almost like, make sure you're comfortable. Make sure you actually know what it feels like to be comfortable before you take that next jump. Because what you might be doing is that kind of adrenaline junkie, like, I only feel alive if I'm abusing myself, basically.
Yeah, if I'm pushing myself beyond the limit.
So people they hear stuff like that, and I think some people go like, oh, well, if I'm comfortable, that's bad. That means I'm not growing. And I'm just like, no. Like, whew. Like right now, are you nourished? Like, sink in and integrate your last journey so that you actually are nourished and resourced, so that you can walk through that next edge. And it's actually going to be a more joyful and comfortable experience than perpetually throwing yourself off a cliff or perpetually getting, shoved into the swimming pool. That swimming pool thing is really interesting, because I do have friends whose parents parented that way.
I learned to swim that way.
And I don't agree with that. I take issue, man. I think that is terrible, to push a kid into a swimming pool. Guess what? End result, they learn how to swim.
Yep.
But you're going to have to reckon with the lack of trust that you just created there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a thing that I use with myself, because I feel like on my spiritual journey, I pushed myself because I felt like I needed to have some kind of bravado or show how like comfortable I was with discomfort or whatever. And I pushed myself into things that ultimately ended up being re-traumatizing, and I had to go back and heal and reckon with the parts of me that weren't resourced and ready for that experience.
Yeah, I mean, there's a place where life does that to us. It really does. Like I said, it drops us off the cliff. I think I said this before, where a 2-year-old learns how to walk before they have the morality of knowing or the judgment. They get this thing like, I can walk. We get our sexual ability before we have the really ability to hold ourselves in a sexual situation and kind of consent at all, right? That happens like in life all the time. Like our development is constantly it actually is ahead of us. Like biology assures that we live life on the kind of an edge, Yeah. And even death, like when the body starts to break down, who's ready to just go ever?
Yeah, that's true.
Just be like, oh, okay, of course I'm just going to lay this down. And by the way, and face, my end of life in decrepitude, like, oof, like it's that is the state. And so it's interesting that is, I think what happens is that that thing requires us to work with each other. And it requires us to work in families and with mentors and with sages and people who have gone before, and to find the assurity that if I go there, I'll be safe.
Yeah.
I can get there. Yeah.
And, another thing when Keith was talking about his daughter that came to me was consent is absolutely impossible and it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
And so there's like a certain amount, especially when you're dealing with adult to adult interactions. And I do this, I teach these safer sexuality workshops, and I teach people about boundaries and consent. And we do exercises and practices with, low risk behaviors like shoulder rubs and, touching someone's hand in a certain way so that people can start practicing these dialogues and feeling their edges and stuff. And when you're actually in a situation where you're sitting there having a conversation with somebody about engaging with them sexually, that conversation goes a long way to mitigate risk. Mm-hmm. But you're never going to know.
Yeah.
What could happen once you cross the edge?
I mean, yeah, like you don't actually know where anyone else's edge is, especially because sometimes they don't.
And you don't know if the other person's saying yes from a place of a traumatized, people-pleasing, fawn response, or if their yes is from a full, mature, I'm saying yes, and I know I can be responsible for any regrets I have.
Yeah.
If this doesn't go well. And so, we can, I think, what you were saying is sometimes the victim gets the blame. And it's because, they consented. Well, did they consent? And
did they have the capacity to consent?
Did they have the capacity to consent? And that's why it's impossible.
Yeah. It's interesting. So you're talking about where do we experience, where do we come to learn this consent stuff? And at the beginning, you were talking about the experience you had with the medical field compared to, getting mic'd by me, right? And it was so funny because at the beginning of my tech experience, I watched someone mic somebody, and they did the very are you cool if I mic you? And they were like, yeah, and they just went on the business. And I was like, what does cool mean? And what does yeah mean? And what is that shrug supposed to imply? And yes, she said yes, but also she looks really uncomfortable. Should you have gone somewhere quieter? And so I very quickly realized through that and conversations as a teacher that a lot of people just have no clue what consent is.
Absolutely.
What it looks like and what the varying degrees of consent look like. So I have this conversation with my kids and today's miking experience, right? Now I know you and I've talked to you before and we've done miking before. So I know that your was a fine consent and a yes, but I train my students that unless you get a yes, that's fine, or yes, thank you, or some kind of enthusiastic consent, it's a no.
Yeah.
And it's not a maybe and it's not an ask again. It's a no and go find an adult. Mm-hmm. And I teach the kids that were teching at the very beginning and I say to them, guys, if you feel uncomfortable and you say to my students, to my tech kids, or okay, or yeah, they won't mic you. So you can still say yes if you're not comfortable and they'll know that that's code for go find an adult. Because a lot of these kids won't say no. Mm-hmm. They think they have to. Yeah. They have to get on stage. They have to get their mic. They have to allow this other random teenage boy they never met before to mic them. And so it's really funny to see. And, I make it really serious. And then we have a bit of fun with it too. And we talk about what's the difference between an enthusiastic yes, enthusiastic consent, and informed consent versus non-informed consent. And, some of these guys, I'll be like, I'm not going to lie to you boys, you've never even experienced informed consent yet. So I'm going to tell you, you've got to...
I'm just so glad you're teaching this to them because it's such a gift.
It's so funny because they'll be like, I know what informed consent is. And I'll be like, you're 16. Your brain is still developing. You know what your level is. But and I say to them, think about you 10 years ago. Could you have consented to a teenage boy touching your face when you were an 8, 9, 10-year-old little girl doing a junior musical? No. Mm-hmm. Not really. So it's a whole thing. And it's so funny because...
But the conversation is still so important because it's training.
Yes, because it gets them thinking about consent in a very different way. Mm-hmm. Not just the sex stuff, not just the what do I do if my girlfriend seems weird? But I also talk to them about like body language and resistance and hesitance, and how those are all cues that can contradict the verbal consent, and that those cues win. You always err on the side of caution. And so, I had a kid who came to me at the last musical and was like, she seems really awkward. I'm like, yeah, it's her first musical. Why don't we see if the director, who is a woman and a friend of hers, can come and do it? And I'm like, what did she say to you? He's like, she said yes, but when I asked her to come over, she walked really slow, or she seemed really hesitant. I'm like, he's getting it. Like, go on, little dude. But, it's one of those things where you have to find opportunities to engage in consent conversations that aren't sexual, because there's so much trauma tied up in the sexual stuff. The conversation hardly ever happens, and
So consent is impossible. It's impossible to get perfect.
Yeah.
Because there's so many factors, so many things that are out of our awareness or control, and it's essential.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think maturity, like the truth of humanity is that we are boundaryless. Like, if we are ourselves, we don't have to worry about boundary, right? Squirrels and lions don't worry about boundary. They're just themselves in their mode of being themselves, right? It's consciousness that can lose track of itself.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Which is the interesting. It's
Yeah.
the interesting place. So the reason why we experience, trauma in the first place is because we're already in a state of separateness, traumatization, right? And then it's the things that exacerbate that separateness. And there's nothing that exacerbates separateness like misunderstood or not consented to, not felt connection.
Right.
Like it's like sarcasm, right? If I say there's nothing that can be worse, as you're a teacher, right? And you're like, good job, or you want to criticize a kid. The worst thing you could say is, oh yeah, you did a really good job on that. It's brutal, right? To say the words of affirmation and not mean
with the energy of cruelty, really.
With the energy of cruelty. And it's brutal to engage with somebody in an intimate way or in an emotional, any kind of intimacy, in a way that isn't really there, because it almost reminds our system that we're so disconnected. And we've built society completely upside down here, like as far as giving anybody any kind of choice on how they should be educated. And you really don't know, like, you're a little kid, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
But at the same time, at least having that in mind, that you're going to, that you're looking for that. We had a really great discussion at Paradigm once about what the difference between a slave and a child is, because in many ways you're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you're trying to get them to a place of sovereignty,
right,
with the child, and giving them all their rights and all their choices as much as they can make, with as much resources as they can make, as soon as possible. But ultimately, we want to get to a place of maturity where, consent is just as important for an adult as it is a child. But we want to get to a place of maturity where we are responsible for ourselves.
Yeah.
Like that's it. And that's, like you said, because consent is impossible and because it's so important and so big, we want to get to the place where we know what we want, what we don't want, and whatever. And, most of my life, I've just assumed people knew.
Yeah.
And I just assumed I knew what those things was. And those assumptions are really, they get knocked out.
Right. Especially when the sexuality comes in, because everybody has their own version of meaning around relationship and sexuality and stuff. And if there hasn't been a conversation, it can get messy.
Assumptions, man. They make an ass out of you and me, right?
You get all sorts of weird things. I've had people engage with me and then say, I didn't like that. And I'm like, you didn't like that I responded to your...
Yeah. And I hugged you back.
No, right. Like what? What is going on here? It's fucking bewildering, right? And you kind of see the dynamics there, and the place to be is sovereignty. That's edgy places where we're in growth require that of us, and if we can't hold that, we won't meet the growth. We'll go to that energy, the edge, it'll be too much, it'll fuck us up, and we'll have to withdraw.
Yeah.
And we'll have to, and that's okay. That's okay to get to a place and be that. It's most times it's better not to push it. And most times it's better to meet it and go, well, I don't know if I'm ready, but we can get in the cycle of failure where we get to a bigger energy and we go, no.
And I feel like that's really good practice. And we talk about that in the sex ed world, where it's like before the interaction, before the eros is running, you decide what your boundary is, and you do not change it.
Yeah.
During the interaction. You might get to that edge and everything in you says, I'm totally fine. So for instance, say you took penetration off the table for this encounter, right? You're like, I don't want to do penetration today. I don't think I'm ready for that. And you get to that point and you're in that total full enthusiastic yes for penetration. Stop.
Yeah.
You don't go over that line. What you do is recognize, oh, we made it all the way to the edge of the fence and we want to go further. So we're going to stay right here within the edge, close the experience, whatever we need to do to give some space to create a container for that walk across that edge. So then, like, next time you're with that person, you can say, okay, this time I want to try that, and this is the container. We're going to take it slow. We're going to check in a lot. We're going to, put these safeguards in place so that it doesn't become a re-traumatization kind of experience.
It's so interesting to me because Steve, when you're talking about like it's consciousness, and it's the fact that we have consciousness that means that we have boundaries and that we're, coming against each other. It's really funny to think of consciousness as a, single thing. We have this combined centralized consciousness. How do you put it, right? But that's the space and that's the thing that causes us to meet boundaries with each other. Like, we're all conscious beings, and our consciousness, like all of our existence is consciousness.
It's likely the same consciousness even.
Right. Like it's likely one octopus with many tentacles, right? And yet those tentacles could really fuck us up. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Right. And because of that experience, like it's even more, it's not less important to be careful. It's more important, right? That creates more importance there. And the shadow guru will always move into ownership. I was doing a consult with a person the other day for some work, and they were talking about a particular person in their life, and I really didn't know the story about how they interacted, but I'm like, oh, he tried to own you, didn't he? And she's like, how did you know, right? Well, because I know what happens, right? People get into a big energy experience, they get inflated, and they think that they are consciousness, and that this person is just a subset of them. People, that's narcissism to a T. And then that becomes difficult. It works the other way too, by the way, where somebody assumes that you are part of them, and you anything you do that they don't like becomes, if they're in a state of inflation,
a personal attack.
It becomes a personal attack. So me setting a boundary, or me disagreeing, or me wanting to do something different from them creates.
That was more like my experience on the other side of that, grandiosity scale. This caretaker thing where it's like, if the other person disagrees with me, I literally collapse. Like, I don't know how to exist in the world. I used to read a dissenting opinion on Facebook, and I would be out for a day. Thank God I'm better than that now, but there's still something there that I'm working with. I want to come back to the squirrel thing though, because I feel like there's some medicine there for us in this process, because I think about things you can do with a squirrel. a person with consciousness and or sentience or whatever you want to call it, and then this animal that doesn't have it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can help help that squirrel override its instinct to be afraid of you.
Mm-hmm.
You can coax it into a trap. You can get it to come, climb up your leg and eat peanuts out of your pocket like my grandpa used to with the squirrels. And then you could, after you gain their trust, you could capture or harm or own.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just curious. I want to hear like what's there for us to work with in this conversation of consent, but also like the energy experience and the consciousness experience with that.
Well, I mean, first of all, it's a person. See, that's a person then who is fucking with a squirrel.
Yeah.
But a squirrel wouldn't do that with a squirrel.
Uh-huh.
So, squirrel and squirrel consciousness meeting another squirrel and squirrel consciousness. They just interact as squirrels. And one might be bossy or whatever, but they're going to have some kind of personality or some kind of whatever, but they're in the squirrels. Human interacting with squirrel is going, because the human's out of the squirrel experience and they're out of the nature experience. They're out of they're not being just resting in themselves. They have this other layer of shit going on, right? That enables them for good and evil to interact with nature in a whole other set of possibilities. Yeah, like we train animals to do weird shit for our entertainments. Is that a good thing?
I have all sorts of ethical issues about owning a dog. I'm just like, I don't know if I would choose this again. The more I've learned about consciousness and consent and freedom, I'm just like, oh, okay.
Maybe yeah, maybe no.
Here's your weird cold cereal kibble that you have to eat every day. You can't eat any other food, even though we're cooking bacon, and it's for your own good. It's terrible.
But it's interesting having a dog, for instance, for a person, having a dog just there, having an animal that's just being themselves there actually takes our nervous system and relaxes it. Right? That's why people have pets. And I don't know if that's a bad place for an animal to be, Like, we're all playing in the same game, and somehow humans got this role. Somehow, the apes.
Thumbs, man. What are you going to do?
We got this role of being outside of it and in it at the same time, And that's the problem with biology. This is why consent is impossible, too. Because the animal body is there. We're just
right.
We're just
and
ape
we
beings.
Are able to be manipulated.
Rocking around. Yeah.
We can be manipulated like the squirrel.
Yeah.
And that's, I think,
part
why
of us
there's that
can.
power dynamic thing or the parent-child thing is you can coax a child to override their instincts, their fear instincts and their edge instincts and whatever, and then get them to do whatever you want. Even just this experience with your child, like, how can you tell a child that their number one motivation is to get the approval of the parents? So how on earth can they really say no?
Yeah. And I deal with a narcissistic person on a regular basis, and I have to see that person's effect on my kids, and I see when they come back and I'm like, you lost a part of yourself while you were there. You were owned while you were there. And I can see that because when they come back in the door, it takes them a day or two to pick up the pieces of themselves that they've had to give away in order to get that approval. And it's like, I know that person knows exactly what they're doing. I know that because I've seen it. And I just think to myself, like, that's when I look at it and I'm like, people are like, oh, we're divine beings. I'm like, some of us are fucking demons, bro. Like, are you kidding me? Like, we're all, right? And like, there's even more than just the animal. Like, because it's sort of like what you were saying, you don't see a lot of squirrel on squirrel violence. You might see some, and there is like territorial disputes, like baboons will go after some shit, right? Like, but like, there are not a lot of beings that are as capable of destruction as we are. And I think that's part of, like, because we have boundaries, we are more capable of destroying other things because we are not, boundaryless, because we don't just overlap each other and accept each other.
Yeah, we have the capacity to take our consciousness out of the ecosystem. and like almost pretend or forget that everything we do has an impact on everything else.
You know, everybody believes in what they're doing. We can say somebody knows, but there's a part of them that thinks that that's at least how it has to be. It's settled into that spot. I think any like the energy of blame, for instance, happens in these edgy places all the time.
Yeah.
And it's always counterproductive. Now there's demanding boundary and accountability is really important. But I will defend the innocence of every single human being on the planet, even the sociopath who can act outside of their humanity without conscience. That person did not choose that, and that's a very, very, very painful life. And they're only trying to find the life. And here's another thing about edges. People will find them. Johnson writes a really great book on ecstasy, the Dionysian principle, right? If we don't have ecstasy in our lives, meaning that increased energy portal, wherever, or condition, we'll find it, right? And the only thing a sociopath has, for instance, I would define that sociopath as like an uber narcissist. It's like a narcissist without the capacity to have any humanity touch them, because literally no conscience is available to them. Like, the only way that they can feel alive is to find another person's edge and totally destroy it. Now, you could say that's evil, and I would agree. But I still can't blame the person whose condition is there. Consciousness is a fucking funny game. And honestly, the end result of a sociopath or a narcissist is, guess what? More consciousness. In fact, it's a very, very fast path for everybody else. And the role they play is tortured, difficult, terrible, must be necessary. And, you know, that's a really weird place to say it, because I've got people in my life who I want to blame pretty hard. And I can't, like, at some point I can't. And even myself, I've made mistakes. I've made stupid mistakes. Interacted with people in unconscious ways that, you know, I can see it from my perspective, seems innocent enough. But you know, you look at it and you go, well, fuck, I screwed that up. You know, I didn't, I wasn't on the side of light and understanding and carefulness. And, you know, I was on the side of stupidity and carelessness in this circumstance, you know. Whew. You know, but the end result of that is always consciousness. Like, if we learn how to work with this, the sociopaths would like take themselves off to a different settlement. If we stop blaming, if they stop feeling put on, you know, and I think we all put them on an island with chainsaws and see what happens, you know. But
going on right now?
They would love it.
About, like,
it would be dog eat dog. They would love it. They would love it. They would all fuck with each other, and then they'd be all chopped up, and it'd be a problem. No problem.
I mean, you know, you may be solving a real, like, global, you know, crisis right now.
I am.
I'm not getting in your way.
I'm just saying. No, I don't know.
I think that's a really great point, and it actually isn't that different than the adrenaline junkie. It's just the adrenaline junkie is kind of ignoring their own humanity, and pushing boundary beyond, you know, what would really be maybe functional or healthy to put yourself at that much risk all the time. Which brings me to something that's like a really fun thing we can do with edges. And that's edging. And this is something that, you know, we do in this like neo-tantra sexual space.
I was definitely wondering. I was like, you guys called it edges for a reason, right? Like, that's like
it can be
this is clickbait right now.
It can be a wonderful practice to do with yourself or with a partner, both to
to understand and feel the different levels of energy as they rise in your system. And, so bringing yourself or a partner to an edge where you're really close to that climax place. And even just thinking about it, like your body will start to like elevate that erotic energy. And then stopping the sensation or pulling the sensation way back. And then letting yourself have the experience of that much energy without having to release it. So you build that up. And, some of the tantric practices will have you breathe it through every cell of your body or channel it to different parts of your body, and play with that energy when it's at that, when you're like approaching that cliff's edge. Work with that energy because you can use it to support your healing. You can use it to support your energy management. This is a thing where men who have issues with premature ejaculation, like they can actually start to practice working with their energy in a way that is more honoring to their experience and system. But we can use that idea of edging in a sexual setting for other parts in our life too. For instance, I spent a year working with disappointment. My system somehow got set up that if I get disappointed, I crash. Completely crash. I will get so excited about something that if it doesn't happen, it just wipes me out, right? And I'm noticing this all throughout my childhood, and as I come into my adulthood, I'm like, okay, this feels immature. This feels like something that's not really helping me. And what can I do with it? And what I started to tell myself is that like disappointment is the universe edging me. So it's like bringing up all that energy, and I can be in the richness of the excitement without the attachment to the climax or the outcome or whatever. And that's really helped me kind of like nourish this orgasmic way of living, this rich way of being with ecstasy without necessarily needing to attach it to, a climax or an outcome.
It's beautiful. You can also go that on the downside. I was noticing this. Well, in my hot bay practice, sometimes it's really difficult. It'll find the density, and I'll want to run away from it. I'll be like, well, that hurts. Like there's something stuck there, like in my solar plexus or in my heart. I'll just get these times where I just feel so sad or so powerless, move into despair. And well, the energy is go into it, meet it without having to solve it. I mean, I think that's on the upside. It's like meeting the ecstasy, meeting the increased energy, finding, and it really is helpful to find that in the body, to find that sensation and then go, okay, can I just be in this and just be with it? And if it's almost like saying yes to that, that difficult energy, then you can be with it more, and it will transform itself.
Yeah, that current is right there also.
Almost always it will transform itself. Yeah, it's there. Life, it's life. Life comes with the death, right? Yeah. Like I said, it's always there. And if you get to experience that, then you get more of yourself in that experience. Because now despair can't take me out. I can be with it, and it will pendulate up into life. The reason why I can feel despair is because I care. This is the funny thing. Everything is love. One of the teachings is everything is love. And if you can feel despair, it's because you give a shit. Because if you didn't give a shit, you could not despair, right? You couldn't be angry. You couldn't hate. Actually, if you couldn't love, you couldn't hate. But it references love. It references connection. It references conscious being, and any sensation is that. If you meet it there, it's just hard. It's really hard to be with despair, especially because that's one that I've felt a few times lately, where I've just it's just been too fucking much, And there's sometimes when I shouldn't. What's that?
The piling of things.
Yeah,
is when it gets hard because, when you're talking about the edging of disappointment and going excited, and then I'm disappointed. And then you find something else to get excited about, and you're up and up and up, and then disappointed. You can live with that. You can deal with that. Even like the sexual edging, you can you can live in that energy, and that energy can be exhilarating because you know something amazing is happening or about to happen or whatever. But it's when we get trapped in the it sometimes feels like every time I take a step back from an edge, the edge comes back with me and I'm still on it. Mm-hmm. Or the despair or the disappointment's pushing me further and further closer to this edge. And I think to myself, sometimes what we talked about earlier, Steve, life is gonna push you to the edge and over. Mm-hmm. Because you have to experience it in order to have anything, in order to know that it's there. I don't even know.
Yeah, life is not safe or consensual. And
you never survive it.
And
no one survives it.
Also, as conscious and evolving human beings, have learned that if we talk about our boundaries and be transparent about our edges, that there's some richness in navigating that together, that you can create a really beautiful place for connection and intimacy by exploring edges, talking about your boundaries, and seeking consent to the best of the ability of the situation.
Yeah, because then we can move out of blame and shame and into accountability and consciousness. Mm-hmm. And then we can move out of I can't handle it into a place of what can I handle? Mm-hmm. What's there? How can I be with this? Yeah. It all of society, the power game keeps us on the other side of this conscious, purposely, because some people decided a long time ago they could use their power to control us, and then somehow we would be better off with that. It's justified, right? and we all bought into that in some way, and just by living, we all almost buy into that. Mm-hmm. One of the things politically right now, one of the things I just think is I don't consent. I haven't voted for a long time because I don't consent. There's an opaque process politically that's happening. I don't care who gets elected. We're fucked. You know, we're fucked one way or fucked the other, but we're fucked. And so to me, until that's transparent and I actually know who's leading and what's happening, I mean, it's very clear. One thing's clear is that all sorts of shit's happening that isn't consensual in the world of politics. I don't consent. And so I treat it that way. And when that affects me on some personal level, I can meet that in any way, but I can meet that in a way that's appropriate, etc. Even if that means me go to jail or something, Mm-hmm. But honestly, I just don't consent. Yeah. In my inner core, I don't consent to being controlled, to being made to fear, to being pushed into a state of confusion and despondency or whatever. I just don't. I get to hold my container as I choose.
Yeah. And it's interesting when we talk about consent. There's, like you said at the very beginning, there is you may consent or not consent. And someone may consent or not consent to give a shit about your consent.
Yeah. Right.
And so it's a game that we're playing of yes, even in the best scenario where I know exactly where my edges are and I know where my boundaries are, I can still get steamrolled. You can still get fucked in this country and have never consented.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you get to recognize that and hold that as
part of the thing.
And ultimately life kicks us out. The ultimate edge is that, right? Like you said, and we don't consent to death. It happens. But that's one of those things where consent on a larger scale is always yes. Right. So I like the David Data line. A lot of David Data teachings kind of outdated for me, but I like the David Data line. What serves love? Mm-hmm. And the funny thing is, the secret behind that is everything. Everything serves love eventually.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be on the side of love, though, and not the side of the unconscious revealer, the resistance to love. Yeah. And that's going to be a better place on our path. And I think in any edge situation, by the way, a great question when the energy is up is, what serves love? Does it serve love for me to jump off this cliff right now? I know the answer is no, but it might be yes at some point.
Or it might be yes.
I have to be very conscious to hold
or,
that. Yes,
a bungee cord or whatever.
Or a nice deep ocean to jump into.
Yeah, and there's always a yes. In the end, life is a yes. We're here. There's something and not nothing. And so if I choose to consent to death, it's a way of consenting to choose to life, right? And that's it. Like, I don't have power over some of the things. I don't have power over so many things that happen to me. But my experience is valid as everybody else's. I was just thinking about this, like I said last time, I'm a complete disaster in so many ways. But my experience is interesting. And I claim it as valid, as useful, as unique, as interesting, as a absolutely piece of art, of work. It's funky art, man. But like, it's art, and if I do that, I'm in yes, and sometimes yes is no. Right. But if my no is a yes, you see, because I'm saying, but what I'm actually doing is saying yes to something else.
Right.
I'm saying yes to a different experience.
No to cliff jumping. Yes to walking away with 2 functioning legs.
Right.
Yeah, right. And ultimately, yes to life.
Yeah.
And to going and where and being how I think the energy is going to make the difference. By the way, I'm also yes to my mistakes. I'm also yes to the times where it doesn't go well, and I don't have good judgment or whatever, right? Like, the more I reject those, I'm hurting myself.
Yeah. That's fun. Thank you for joining us today. This was a really, really interesting,
really edgy conversation.
Edgy conversation. We absolutely love input and would love to hear your questions or have you as a guest on our podcast. So if either of those interests you, find our Facebook page, Conversations with Life, or Soul and Spirit Wellness. We also have a website, soulandspiritwellness.com. And you can listen, like, share, and subscribe on all the major